Okay. It's the 16th of May. Welcome to Dis and Dat. We're going to continue on more circuits of capital today. Recall that yesterday we were looking at the model provided, probably in the last instance, by David Harvey, describing a complete economy, one that is open to eco-socialism, certainly, to identify all of the elements and how capital operates. Ultimately, some things will probably have to be, you know, expropriated, um, appropriated by the state, but that ain't going to happen in my lifetime, much as I'd like that to happen. So, needless to say, we talked yesterday, as we've talked before, about the two spheres of production and consumption, Departments 1 and Department 2, from Volume 2 of Karl Marx's Capital. And needless to say, there's still work to be done. Um, as I suggested yesterday, the equation remains the same. It's a MCM with modifications. MCM, CMC are part of the circuits, how the circuit of capital operates, and that it is the idea that it occurs in motion, that is, that it's dynamic as opposed to static, or at least sets of different motions, as Eldred and Roth describe it, as I pointed out yesterday in a piece from 1978. That is, the three forms of circuits of capital are due simply to taking different starting points and considering the ongoing circulation of capital. This is not unlike the entry point arguments that, for example, Rick Wolf takes from Althusser. This is not complicated. This is, in fact, a reasonable approach to describing the dynamics without getting into a big math fight, which, you need to do that at some moment. But the point is, as Eldred and Roth and so many others have tried to point out, and there are better examples of this, but I like going back to the Eldred and Roth example because it simply draws it out as it occurs. It is built off of a model that, is Marx's reflection on Ricardo, saying, okay, well, we started, with feudalism, enclosures, land, and then land and capital, and then how capital evolves as a means of sort of accounting for the more abstract relations among humans as they develop nature, the land. And you can see that there are phases, part one, part two, part three. These describe those moments that I just, showed. Their entry points, and it is possible to certainly have, more assets, more resources, etc. each time you enter the circuits, and they're plural circuits. It's not a singular circuit. It'd be great if it were, but in fact, that is the sort of optimum, from a communist point of view. But the fact is, that's just never going to occur because reality is, it's in time and space, as they say, and it's not all happening at once, thank goodness. So these moments you can see have articulations or further details, and there are circulation stages. And the idea is, and this is why we're back to, describing feudalism or techno-feudalism, because this whole business of what the commodity is in this particular context also relates to the idea of fallows, or that is, things that are left aside, that they're in effect unpaid in another kind of way. Money fallows in which money lies fallow as latent money capital. So the idea of a latency in money capital is also important. This describes the lags or the gaps and the phases of these circuits, right? That all doesn't all match up. It's not all perfectly synchronous. It's a whole system of asynchronous circuits. And the simple way, of course, is to just describe it. Well, that's how people dealt with the land, right? You would, cycle your crops, occasionally or on a regular basis talking about certain portions of your land to lie fallow in order so that it can either regenerate or you can prepare it for another season in a different way. And it does require time, space, soil, etc. Marx is concerned about these things. He's concerned about these things all the way up to the end, where he begins to be more interested in natural science and soil science, for example. He concerns himself at various moments in his life with the kind of chemistry of the soil. And yeah, that doesn't sound like an economist. It sounds more like an ag economist or an agronomist or whatever. Uh, but the idea is still there. It's an important idea. It's one that is based in reality. And even if you're into hydroponics or some other kind of deal, there is a whole question of cycles that are at work, whether it's the water cycle and, the all of these other kind of generative, the climate cycles, etc. All of these cycles are important. They're part of the web, the web of life, the web of nature. The point is, of course, that these cyclical elements, as circulation, are clearly part of how you deal with the model. And explaining it often gets tied up with the sort of static modeling that you sort of need to describe all the pieces. That is, this is one moment. And with all due respect, it is poorly described from a pedagogical point of view that, static modeling, while fine and good and important, you do need to always understand that it's a heuristic on the one hand. On the other hand, it is simply modeling. Now, the special manner of circulation of fixed capital, this is Eldred and Roth. It looks complicated. It's just the same diagram we were just looking at, and we're looking at varieties of fixed capital, circulating capital. And you can see circulating capital 1, circulating capital 2 et al. So we were just looking at this brief little moment, the same moment that we're looking above, but we're looking at certain things that are more fixed or held in order to create something else or to develop something else. And so you have these different little articulations built into this. And of course, you can see the fallow element in there as well, and so on. It is, in fact, this is not complicated. And you don't even have to go to advanced math to figure this out, that obviously there are going to be marginal relations among these things. So opposing a Marxian model by saying, well, it doesn't account for marginalist stuff, it's all there. It's just that, Marx had other things to do. And, it's not to explain it away, but the fact of the matter is it would have been great had he been able to interact more with those folks who are working in parallel on marginal analysis. And I think that is what happens eventually, that some people, including the Japanese, decide, okay, that stuff was there too, so let's put it all together. And I think that you have some very fruitful research that does that. But backing up, we can see that just the stuff that you have there with Marx, what he provided in books, volumes 2 and 3 of Capital, and the theories of surplus value, all of that is there. It just needs to be sorted out, just like Engels spent a fair amount of time trying to sort it out, with varying success. And needless to say, Engels had his own thing that was really important to augment or to as complement to Marx's stuff, right? Needless to say, this is also Eldred and Roth, and you can see if you take a little time, you can see all of the things that we've talked about here are they attempt to account for everything that is written textually, right? Sustenance, consumption, laborers, etc. All of these departmental or interdepartmental, you can see here's Department 2 right over here and Department 1 right over here. So the entire economy, or let's say a little toy economy, has all of these interrelations, the interdependencies. And yeah, Marx gives you little numbers to plug in and et cetera, et cetera. And he is showing a kind of little system there, a little mathematical system with margins, with gaps, differentiation, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And It's important to see that it's not as theoretical as you would say, one would say. It is, in fact, quite, in paper three of Eldred Roth, um, it's just there. And it's worth studying again. And needless to say, one need not get it too horribly complicated about this, but you can see that there is a primary circuit of capital. This is the same one, ostensibly, and this is Harvey's example, and shows what circuits that Harvey is talking about. That is the technical and social organization of the work process. That it is both about production and about consumption in Department 1 and Department 2, quantities and capacities of the labor force. And their labor is involved. Labor wasn't cut out in this, even in the Eldred Roth model above. The point is that we don't get too crazy about it. And that's exactly why Steve Keen tries to sort of say, okay, just calm down. And labor isn't completely out of the question. It is simply, part of the problems of capital. It doesn't disclaim, the working class or, class struggle. I think all of those things still are part of this. It's just simply that we need to talk about capital and be more careful about capital. This is why there's an entire body of, argument related to the problems of capital still, each with their own sets of biases and preferences. And, financialization has increased in scope and has become ever more um, threatening, let's put it that way, critical, chronic. And the point, of course, is when this David Harvey model, you see fictitious capital in the capital market. Uh, 2008 showed that this is exactly the problem, and it is it's part of the crisis. It is a permanent feature of capitalism. It's just there. It seems normal and incredibly problematic. And Marx said, well, it does seem kind of regular or at least episodic, and we've got to sort of deal with it. And so secondary and tertiary circuits of capital have to be attended to. On the one hand, in a simple pure capitalism, you have, fixed capital, producer durables, built environment, and then on the Department 2 side, consumption fund, consumer curables, and built environment as well. So there's transfers, capital transfers, whole money capital and savings, a debt repayment on both sides. It's all there. It's really how a basic little economy sort of works when you assume money and a variety of other things. The tertiary circuit of capital is kind of where all the problems have come, and they exist now. State functions in the current American position, it's being disrupted, more than disrupted, because of manipulation of issues of tax policy, innovation, destruction of state functions in terms of innovation. Who is better qualified or capable? And we now see that ignorant people would love to just sort of claim that the private sector will solve these problems when in fact it doesn't, and in fact has is part of the problem. And the need for regulation, control, guidance, um, better served by people who have the public's interests in mind. And lest you think that capitalism will do it because of a market, you're really fooling yourself. And needless to say, it is complicated. It doesn't disclaim the fact that there's social banditry exists, and social banditry exists, with all due respect to Barclay and um, Hobsbawm and all those folks. The fact of the matter is, social banditry exists at a variety of class levels, and they're not a lumpen in that sense. I think that gets into a much deeper question of the more psychiatric elements that more modern or advanced theories have accumulated. Now, on to that. Now, so from yesterday, I described this as, this is a Harvey model. This is the same model as I put in at the top here. It's just collapsed into, it's the same thing as what you see in the center here. Harvey is consistent in these matters. He just simply keeps expanding these little things, and it makes perfect sense to him. And I hope it makes sense to you. Not that I fully subscribe to this, but you can see that it sort of sets out, the question of labor productivity versus innovation here with the paid, unpaid, the state, um, capital, etc. Now, the model I introduced yesterday was the idea that you can the metaphor, and I don't think it's a problematic metaphor now. And the history of economics has been a problem of sort of trying to find all the right metaphors. The question of the analogy and the philosophy of science argument that is economics a science and blah blah blah, is it dismal, blah blah blah. Um, all of those sort of rhetorical strategies are interesting but not very useful. I think what ultimately is involved, and once you get down to the empirical details, it does seem to me that you have to say that one of the most interesting ideas about modeling this is to say that it is like a maglev train. That is, the way in which magnetism drives a maglev train forward, this idea of alternating, attraction and repelling with superconducting magnets allows the way in which you can move a train quickly with little friction and literally double the speed of railway cars. Now, that's a very simple model, but it is a kind of 19th century model. That is the connection of capital with relatively frictionless technology. And Marx spends not a lot of time, but a little time talking about the railways as means of communication. And so, anyway, that's how that argument is built. Now, we yesterday I was reading from the Steve Keen article, and that there is a contradiction. There's a variety of other little things that he talks about here from a foundational level, and I guess we can start somewhere here and see if we can get to the end without making ourselves too crazy. Now, so essentially, Marx reached the result that the means of production cannot generate surplus value by confusing depreciation or the loss of value by a machine with value creation. The truisms that the maximum amount of value that a machine can lose is its exchange value, and that a machine's exchange value will fall to zero only when its use value is completely exhausted. Um, this is an important point, that a machine's exchange value will fall to zero only when its use value is completely exhausted. This is combined with the truism that the maximum amount of value that a machine can lose is exchange value. So it's combined to conclude that the value a machine adds in production is equivalent to the exchange value it loses in depreciation. Now, with the value added by a machine equated to value lost, no net value is transferred to the product. It sort of zeroes out, right? And therefore, only labor can be a source of surplus value. Now, this argument may appear plausible. In reality, it involves a confusion of two distinct attributes of a machine. That is, its cost in terms of exchange value, and its usefulness, which is use value itself. From a Marxian perspective, depreciation is the writing off the original exchange value of a machine over its productive life. Consequently, the maximum depreciation that a machine can suffer is its exchange value. What's it going to be worth, when it gets older? As it wears out, both its residual value and its usefulness will diminish, and both will terminate at the same time, right? It's just physical limitation. However, it does not follow that the usefulness, that is, the value creating capacity of the machine, is equal to its cost, that is, its depreciation. Though a capitalist will write off the latter completely only when the former has been extinguished, the two aspects are nonetheless completely different and unrelated. There is no reason why the value lost by the machine should be equivalent to the value added. An analogy with labor highlights the fallacy involved in equating these two magnitudes. If workers receive a subsistence wage, and if the working day exhausts the capacity to labor, then it could be argued that in a day, a worker depreciates by an amount equivalent to the subsistence wage. That's the exchange value of labor power. However, this depreciation is not the limit of the amount of value that can be added by a worker in a day's labor. A couple extra cups of coffee, blah, blah, blah. The use value of labor, value added, or, crystal meth or something, value added is unrelated to and greater than value lost. If it were not, there would be no surplus. Now, that seems like a tautology, but the fact of the matter is that is the kind of reality. Marx's dialectics provides the axiomatic basis on which to discern between value added and depreciation, and thus reject the identification of value creating capacity with value lost. So it's not an equivalence in that sense. As discussed above, depreciation can be equated to exchange value when a machine's contribution to production is its actual use value. According to Marx's analysis of commodities, these should be two different magnitudes, since for all commodities, the two aspects in no way enter into relation with each other. Marx did, in fact, reach this conclusion at one point in the Grundrisse. This is where the idea is these bodies of critiques of political economy sort of, come into congruence. In the midst of a mass of arithmetic exploring how machinery could reduce the price of a product, thus giving an advantage to the capitalist who introduces it, and yet resulting in a lowering of the rate of profit, Marx suggested precisely the method that he should have used to apply his dialectic of commodities to the question of the value productivity of machinery. Quote, it also has to be postulated, which was not done above, that the use value of the machine significantly greater than its value, i.e., that its devaluation in the service of production is not proportional to its increasing effect on production. Here, Marx specifically referred to the use value of a machine being greater than its value, and in contrast to his discussion of depreciation in capital, dissociated the productivity of a machine from its depreciation. The use value of a machine will differ from its exchange value, and as with labor, we can assume that its use value will be significantly greater than its value. Now, in practice, what does this mean? This means that the amount that it loses in depreciation will be significantly less than the amount that it contributes to the value of output, and it will, with labor, be a source of surplus value. In other words, there's always going to be, some kind of thing added. And if you want to call it value added, sure, fine. The point is that things accumulate in that particular context. Unfortunately, Marx never developed this kind of postulate. Marx's later developments of his dialectic as it relates to value creation tarnished rather than polished the tool, obscuring the fundamental contradiction it uncovered in his labor theory of value. Now, the quantification of use value on page 6 of Keynes' little piece here, and to remind you what the piece is, it is use value, exchange value, and the demise of Marx's labor theory of value. And sorry, give me a second here to page 6, the quantification of use value. In his algebraic and numeric explorations of value creation, Marx compounded his previous logical errors by using the same magnitude for the exchange value and the use value of the means of production, while using different magnitudes for the exchange value and use value of labor power. So you can see this is the deal here. The inputs to a productive process are heterogeneous labor and a heterogeneous collection of goods. Given the input side of the productive process as big C equals little c plus V, C, little c, is clearly the exchange value of the means of production. And V is the exchange value of labor power. The output is a commodity plus depreciated capital equipment, and the value equation, that is C prime, equals C plus V plus S. This is nothing new, quantifies this gross output. This equation is of itself unproblematic since all it states is that production generates a surplus, S. The difficulties arise when portions of that net output are attributed either to the labor power and the commodity inputs. So, it's obvious that this is an identification problem. Marx's claim that the surplus S, small s, is proportional to small v and unrelated to small v describes V plus S as the use value of labor and C, lowercase c, as the use value of the means of production. Now, Marx made the former identification explicitly on numerous occasions, including the passage in Capital, where he first reveals the source of surplus value. This is in the 1867 text. And also, hinted at in 1857. There are numerous other passages where the use value of labor is identified with similar concepts such as surplus value, productive consumption, etc. Now, while his characterization of lowercase c as the use value of the means of production was never so definitive, Marx nonetheless was explicit that the quantitative measure of a machine's contribution to production was its use value, not its exchange value. Now, it has an exchange value, but, anyway. Quote, so far as constant capital enters into the production of commodities, it is not its exchange value, but its use value alone which matters. And what we're talking about here is the point in the process, right, on the timeline. Anyway, the assistance rendered by a machine to, say, 3 laborers does not depend on its value, but on its use value as a machine, unquote. Now, thus the contribution of the means of production to the value of output is its use value. However, the quantity which Marx gave for the use value of a machine was C, lowercase c, which is also its exchange value. So there's confusion here, right? It's an identification problem. The identification of lowercase c as both the exchange value and the use value of the means of production was a feature of every numerical example given by Marx in all of his economic works. Now, in attributing a quantity to this use value, Marx essentially continued Ricardo's implicit practice of treating capital's contribution to output as identical to its input. And, I think even empirically, if you're sort of taking a critical realist point of view, you go, well, you can't do that. That's kind of you're kind of making an assumption you can't make. The following table summarizes Marx's argument in Volume 1 on the source of surplus value and the use value / exchange value dialectic. So here you go. You have 2 columns, labor power and commodity inputs. You have exchange value, V for labor power, lowercase, C for commodity inputs. Use value is V plus S. Commodity input is still C. Are they different from a labor power point of view? Sure they are. Of course they are. From a commodity inputs point of view, no, they aren't. They're the same. Is surplus generated? Yes. From the point of view of labor power, yes, they are, because there's more variability, and hence, I shoot you up with crystal meth, whatever. That's not the complete way of describing it, but I'm being a little, profane there. Commodity inputs are not surplus generated. Now, are they consistent with Ricardo? Yes, they are in both ways, right? Labor power and commodity inputs, which is what Ricardo assumed. Are they consistent with a dialectic, which is different from Ricardo? They are on the labor side, and they're not from a commodity input point of view, because, and so the implication, of course, is that there's a kind of determining or over or under determining that is about labor power, which is abstract. It is not labor itself. Remember, it's not labor itself. This is about capability, capacity, about will, about other kinds of things that are differentiated from fixed capital, for example. The problem with this customer quantification is that it contradicts Marx's fundamental and oft-repeated proposition that use value and exchange value are unrelated. The central point of this paper is that in the Grundrisse, Marx transformed the classical distinction between exchange value and use value and the classical proposition that use value plays no role in determining exchange value into a dialectical foundation for his economics. Now, that's really important. There's a classical proposition, and then there's a dialectical kind of critique of that that says, well, that there's something else going on here. And as maglev trains or something. Prior to this pivotal logical advance, Prior to this pivotal logical advance, there was no problem with Marx continuing to follow Ricardo on the issue of value, productivity of machinery. Marx simply made explicit in his theory a concept which was arguably implicit in Ricardo. The assertion that labor is the only source of value could be maintained, albeit with all the technical problems of a labor theory of value. But his development of the dialectic between exchange value and use value makes this claim logically untenable. The axiom that use value plays no role in determining exchange value means that in the sphere of consumption, Department 2, use value and exchange value are incommensurable. That is, not commensurable, in contrast to the neoclassical schema, which makes utility and price commensurable through the devices of marginal utility and marginal cost. This is the fundamental difference. This is the reason why an entire, kind of pedagogical body of work is well, they're, you can't do one with the other, or they don't, it's hard to explain it. Well, the reason why it's hard is because you've got to explain stuff like, well, humans are involved, and yeah, stuff's different, and yeah, subjectivity can be, normal, stupid, ignorant, radical. Anyway, in the sphere of production, Department 1, where both exchange value and use value are quantitative, it means that they're normally, although not necessarily, different. Yet to argue that the quantified use value of the means of production is the same as their quantified exchange value is to argue that in the case of the means of production, exchange value and use value are identical. So, this is, Keen driving the point home. Conclusion. The conclusion that labor cannot be the only source of value has long ceased to be novel. It's just not. As well as being fundamental to neoclassical economics, it has been asserted explicitly or implicitly by, among others, and they do it for a variety of reasons. In some ways, it's to get the math to work. It's to drive a point about equilibrium. It's a point to drive a whole bunch of other matters. So if you looked at this particular list, the usual suspects, right? Strauss, Steedman, Bose, Opposé, Hodgson, Romer, Wolf, and Bandeopate, and Carling. I mean, it's good stuff to read. It's really important. It is kind of a canonical in that sense. What is novel about this proof is that it has been reached using Marx's fundamental logic. Now, that's kind of, that it is thus rather more difficult for those who wish to maintain a labor theory of value to oppose, since in the past, the last refuge of defenders of the labor theory has been that, well, it's because Marx said it was so. This is Keen. I hope that I've shown that had Marx properly applied his own damn logic, he would have said that it was not. Another difference is that since these conclusions flow naturally from Marx's own reasoning, those parts of his analysis, which do not depend on labor being the only source of value, remain intact. Other critics of the labor theory of value would abandon Marx's historical analysis, his use of the dialectic, and the concept of value itself. This is, that's where it breaks, that's where people go off and say, well, it's got to be, there are other solutions, and we don't, the criticism is not viable. But, there's some things that are just, it's there. You can see it, in the critical realist sense, it's there. Similarly, his comments on the reproduction process, the circuits of capital, and the cyclical nature of capitalism are in no way affected. In other words, you can argue theory of value, but it doesn't, invalidate the kind of methodology. Conversely, his conclusions, which depend upon labor being the only source of value, are in general overturned. I mean, you just have to say, that was a problem. He didn't quite do it right, and let's accept that and move on because there's certainly a whole bunch of other things, the behavior of capital, the nature of capitalism, et cetera, are all still, doing what they do, and they do not depend on your labor theory of value in order to get the critique to work. Chief amongst these are, and we're going to go on to this, the transformation of value into prices and the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Now, now you could, try and say, well, labor makes this the theory, labor theory of value makes, gets in the way. No, it doesn't. It just doesn't. I mean, this is the nice thing about Keynes is that he says, it's just it has this fundamental difference. It is a problem of either dislocating or holding in abeyance certain assumptions that you make because of the relationship between Marx and Ricardo, et cetera. And recalling that you're building a critique, you're not building necessarily a displacement theory of some kind, a substitute. It's not it's not like that. It is this larger project that is located in reality that has certain natural features that is problematic and requires a shifting of your sense of what counts as heuristic or whatever. The transformation problem is derived from the proposition that labor is the only source of surplus value and that the rate of surplus value is uniform across industries, whereas profit is proportional to the capital expended on both labor power and commodity inputs. Were these premises valid, then there would be a divergence between rates of surplus value and rates of profit when the ratio of commodity inputs to labor inputs varied between industries. However, the proof that every input to production can be a source of surplus value establishes that the rate of surplus value should tend towards uniformity across industries for the same reason that rates of profit should tend to be uniform. That is capitalist competition, right? It is the dynamic element of it, the shifting between modalities, right? The dynamic features, the shift between time periods, things that, competition in space and time are part of that. Therefore, there is no a priori reason why issues pertaining exclusively to production itself, Department 1, such as the ratio of capital to labor, should cause a divergence between rates of capital value and between rates of there is thus no reason why a higher capital slash labor ratio than average should be associated with a lower rate of surplus value than average. No technical problem in converting values to prices of production, and no reason why prices should systematically diverge from values or rates of surplus from rates of profit solely on the basis of differences in capital intensity. Now, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall suffers a similar fate. This tendency, like the transformation problem itself, was founded on the proposition that labor was the only source of value and that there was a tendency over time for the ratio of capital to labor, measured in value terms, to rise. Now, since surplus can be garnered from all inputs to production, there's no reason why an increase in the ratio of commodity to labor inputs should lead to a decline in the overall rate of surplus. So, this, using Marx's own logic, confirms Steedman's judgment from a Straussian perspective that the transformation problem is, yes, a pseudo problem, a chimera. But, decades were spent on this damn thing. Indeed, indeed, the entire dispute between Marxians and Straussians can itself be judged a chimera, since Marx's theory of value, in fact, provides the philosophical foundation for an absolute theory of value, consonant with Straussian analysis, in which commodities in general, in a system of commodity production, are regarded as the source of surplus value. Now, some people, it makes people's, uh, heads hurt, hair hurt. Um, it's not a disclaimer that there is and I've explained this before, this doesn't disclaim the reality that class struggle exists, that, that there's exploitation and blah, 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 blah. All those things occur. And so sources of surplus value are much more complex in that context. It's just some people don't want to tackle it because, they assume, well, we've always, it's always got to be labor exploitation. Well, as people like Piketty, et cetera, have talked about, you know, there's a there are ways in which you can talk about value questions that involve other kinds of elements that are, contingent, still contingent. Further development of the method discussed in this paper should provide many worthwhile additions to the intellectual weaponry of Marxian analysis in this new tradition, which can exist cooperatively with Straussian and Kaleckian economics while containing the superior concepts of dialectics of value and value. It should be to Marx's credit that he provided the analysis by which the labor theory of value could be transcended and labor and commodities together regarded as the joint sources of value. And this raises an important question in analysis for the idea that joint products, a certain way in which you can analyze the spatial disposition of capital and labor as spatiotemporal problems, and certainly a kind of suggestion that Harvey would be happy to talk about. So all of these matters connect, and yes, if you get a couple of these guys in the same room, they might not agree on certain things. The structure of demand, the certain agency and structure questions, whole bad math. There's other stuff. So one should be able to, as Keene says, transcend these kind of matters and get to what I think, and I'm going to return to this, in the question of enclosures or enclosuring. Yes, I'm going to make it into a verb, enclosing as opposed to enclosuring, that we can begin to describe certain ways of differentiating spatiotemporal kind of value questions, and that there are empirical means by which we can measure such things as a kind of layered or modeled surfaces of demand, supply, or capital, and I hope we can get there eventually at some brief and shining moment. So at this bright and shining moment, I look at the time, and I'm close to my endpoint anyway, and there's no one around to ask any damn questions. So ha ha ha. Let me point out that in the reference here, there's all of the important books that you should be reading, simply because it gives certain elements that provide a deeper look at certain questions of, for example, the value question. For example, a broader, more dynamic view of the concept of entry points. A variety of things that you should consider. So this is a good canonical collection of references, and I'm grateful that Steve in 1993 decided he would make this available.